Delighted to be joined in the studio by a regular friend of the channel, Peter Bleksley, former Metropolitan Police detective. Peter, you've been around the block a few times with the greatest of respect. You've been seen the whole issue of protecting MPs, politicians, senior figures. How concerned are you, given where we are in the UK, what's going on in the world, relative to previous election periods? Or am I over-dramatising this?
And I'm just going to add that I've also provided close protection to high net worth individuals in the commercial sector, having left the police. So security is very much my bag. I think essentially this is going to have to come down to the decision of the individual MP. Of course, so many of them pride themselves on their accessibility, and I'm sure that many would not want to surrender that in any way, shape or form. After all, if they're not accessible and they're not engaging with the public, how are they going to hear about the issues that affect us all? That said, let's not forget Jo Cox in 2016. When, of course, she was murdered by a white supremacist. Now, prior to Jo's murder, there hadn't been an MP killed for 26 years, and those previous murders of MPs were by Irish Republican terrorists. So a 26-year gap, then Jo Cox tragically loses her life, and 5 years later, Sir David Amess.
So two MPs murdered within a 5-year period indicates that actually things are getting more divided, there's more anger, and the situation is getting worse. And then we've had a regional conflict, Gaza, the whole Palestine issue, and we're already seeing something. So open access is important. It'd be interesting to hear what the audience think about this. So how do we get the best of both worlds? How do we protect those politicians, the MPs, whilst retaining that access?
Quite simply, you can't. And I know that sounds like an unpalatable answer, but whilst there is no such thing as absolute security, proper security creates a distance between the principal and anybody who may cause a threat. And to do that properly, to provide real close protection, to guarantee as much as you can somebody's safety, you need a considerable number of close protection operatives.
And so would that, so if you, let's say, you said, well, we need some protection. You can't provide absolute protection. I suspect we all get that. So do you think that realistically would come from the police? They're obviously under massive pressure in terms of resources. Or actually, could you rely on private security contractors to provide a couple of hundred operatives for the most exposed, the most vulnerable MPs, for example?
Yeah, well, of course, our police already protect royalty, they protect the Prime Minister and other significant politicians. I think there would be some pushback against protecting constituency MPs. I'm sure they'd be very swift to advise about safety and security of their premises, their staff and them as individuals. But if we're going to have protection rolled out across far many more MPs, then the provider of that, I'm sure, will be the commercial security sector. And these operatives are not cheap. I'm not talking about the kind of cosmetic bodyguard that we see celebrities having. They have an expensive handbag draped on one arm and a huge, enormous, great bodyguard on the other. Well, generally speaking, that provides very, very limited protection. The most professional operatives are highly trained at some considerable expense, and they do not come cheap.
No.
You will pay... an operative...
And in a sense, that's the question, whether voters, taxpayers are willing to pay more for the security of those who put themselves up for election. And things like, I think I'm right in saying that MPs now can get alarms installed in their homes and other advice and measures. I mean, things like stab vests, is that a useful risk reduction, let's put it like that?
It's dramatic and it's quite appalling. It says a lot about the state of our nation when a democratically elected MP has to resort to wearing a stab vest. And quite frankly, if somebody's got that close, with a bladed instrument, with a knife, with a weapon, any kind of security has failed, because you want to ensure that no such person could get close enough to inflict...
It's like protection of last resort, I guess.
Yes, it is. And it's very sad to hear Mike Freer having to resort to that.
I mean, it really is. And I just wonder, I mean, I think most MPs would sort of be horrified at the thought of reducing their access. But equally, I know that some have been targeted, particularly from the Labour Party. They've had demonstrations at homes, recently elected MPs. Their children have been harassed going to school. They're terrified and worried about that. And you just think, actually, this is not going to end well unless something changes.
But when those situations happen, we want prompt, professional, robust policing response. So anybody that is threatening, intimidating an MP or their family are arrested, charged, put in front of a court and suitably punished. That will be a good deterrent. But of course, it will not affect the troubled mind, the murderers of Joe Cox and David Amis, sadly. Those people, deeply troubled minds, radicalised, intent on murderous behaviour, are very challenging to stop.
And looking for weaknesses in the system, essentially. And obviously, as long as the horrific regional conflict in the Middle East continues, those divisions, that angst, that anger will continue alongside it.
Yes, I'm sure they will. And we ought to be thankful that we've got security services and counter-terrorism police who 24/7, 365 days of the year are on red alert to this radicalisation and do so much to stop terrorism plots. They largely are unsung heroes, and for them, we owe them a great debt.
Peter Bleksley, I'm sure we'll be coming back to this, but thank you so much for your thoughts and your experience on this difficult subject. I'd much rather not be talking about it at all.